screen here. Now, if I maximize this, can you still hear me and see it okay?
Yep, it's all good.
Okay. So you should have pretty well full screen with the first slide here. And then what I've got at top when I'll click is the various handouts. So I'm just clicking through the handouts that are relevant for the lecture today. So when I click from one to another, they should appear all right. Do they? Okay.
Yep.
Okay, very good. Now, what I'll do today is talk a little bit about the history of evolutionary biology, particularly talking about some of the important advances that have been made really in the last, I suppose it's 50 years now, since the 1970s, though we will start, of course, before Darwin. And of course, humans have always been interested, I think, in heredity and evolution, even with rather vague ideas of what it's all about. I don't think it's possible for anybody at any time to view these marine iguanas and Sally Lightfoot crabs on the Galapagos Islands, this basaltic lava on the edge of the ocean, without wondering about life. And of course, Darwin did introduce this whole idea really properly of a branching tree of life. And a famous drawing of this is this one here by Ernst Haeckel in the 1870s, who was a German scientist, a great proponent and follower of Darwin. And of course, this is this famous tree, the genealogical tree of humanity, and showing it as a big branching tree getting narrower and narrower to the peak humans at the top. Now, of course, this was the view for many, many centuries that, of course, humans are the pinnacle of evolution. Of course, this is quite false. We just happen to be a very small twig on the huge bushy tree of life, and it's probably just as much by accident that we ended up existing as not. And it's been said many times by many people like Stephen Jay Gould, for instance, if we were to rerun the whole evolution of life on Earth, it'd be very unlikely that we would end up here again. Chance events do play a big role in evolution, and basically evolutionary biology is a historical subject. We only know what has happened in the past. We can make some projections and some predictions about what we might find when we look through the tree of life, how bats may be related to monotremes, the egg-laying mammals and so on. But we really are just analyzing and sample size of one life on Earth since the beginning about 3.8 billion years ago. So there are some philosophical aspects. Now, actually, I did write up a little thing on the philosophy of science I used in one of my other courses last time. I will post that. It's not very long, but it does get into some of those aspects. So what we can do in evolutionary biology is make hypotheses about relationships. We can use population genetics to make some reasonable predictions about what we might find, and then we can go out and test it. But it is a historical subject, which of course makes it difficult, but also very interesting. So a little bit on the history of evolutionary thought. Of course, Charles Darwin here on the left as an old man. He did, of course, his famous voyage when he was a young man. On the right is R.A. Fisher, Sir R.A. Fisher, the great statistician and geneticist, who, along with J.B.S. Haldane and Sewell Wright in the 1930s, really founded population genetics that properly synthesized Mendelism, Mendelian inheritance of genes, with Darwinism, gradual change over time. And this has become to be known the modern synthesis, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Now, of course, well before Darwin, many scientists did have some really important ideas about the evolution of Earth and life on it. And of course, you've got to remember that right until Darwin and after, the basic idea was that the Earth had been created once, and all the species on Earth had been created specially to fulfill their niche, and they were never changing, never had changed, and therefore were fixed in time. Now, however, early scientists like George de Buffon in the 1700s did realize that Earth probably had formed according to laws of physics, and that there was a scientific, natural explanation of the formation of the Earth and life on it. Again, this was taken up by quite a few people in the 1700s, and one particular interesting one was Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, who was a very well-known physician, but also taught and wrote a lot about plants and animals, and really had a good idea of, or some ideas anyway, of how life evolved from a single common ancestor. He talked about ecological things like competition and sexual selection, and suggested that there can be changes in species. Now, I've got a handout on him in a moment, but also I have put in this handout, which does give you a brief chronology of evolutionary thought. I've taken this from a web page from the American Museum of Natural History that was published in the Darwin Bicentennial in 2009. And again, there's a little bit more detail there, so you can have a look at that and go to that link. I don't know what happens if that will appear or not, but again, there's a little bit more history here, as well as in Ridley, again mentioning Erasmus Darwin and so on. So do look at that if you're interested. Now, Erasmus Darwin was a very interesting person, again, a very well-known physician, but also quite a writer, and he was quite a ladies' man too, apparently. He had two wives, and this is this little family tree showing Erasmus Darwin, and Charles Robert Darwin is our Darwin. He did have that's right, his uncle Charles, another Charles Darwin, a different Darwin, who was a physician also, and wrote a very interesting paper in the 1800s on the difference between pus and mucus. If anybody's interested, you can find a copy of that. I can get you a copy of that. As you can see, one of Darwin's relatives, a cousin, was Francis Galton, again, a pioneering statistician, a polymath. He was a person who sort of invented taking fingerprints. Darwin, of course, and Darwin did, of course, marry his cousin, it's not really shown here, Susanna Wedgwood of the Wedgwood pottery family. Yeah, here we are, yes, Emma Wedgwood. And they had 10 children. And again, some of these were really prominent scientists. It's quite a remarkable family. And again, there's a lot written about Darwin and his family and so on. Now, Erasmus Darwin wrote these books on biology, zoology, and botany, and so on. And you can get all of these free. Again, you can find them. If anybody's interested, I can send you a copy of this. I've downloaded it. And one of his most famous ones was The Temple of Nature, or The Origin of Society. This was actually published after his death. There's quite a few different editions of it. But what is interesting about Erasmus Darwin's writing is that the actual main text was written in the form of a poem, which you might find rather strange, and it certainly is not what's done now. But this is a book of a few hundred pages written as a poem, but it was still science because what he had as footnotes were his scientific explanations of the various stanzas. And it really is quite, I haven't read it all, I admit, but I've read some of it, and it really is quite neat. And I just read an analysis of his works, and in the Temple of Nature, he tried to relate myths of creation and so on with what was known scientifically in those days. So if you look through this, I've just got PDFs of a few of the pages, and you can read through it. Again, if you want to get the whole thing, it's actually quite interesting to look at. So on this is page 15. It's kind of neat to see. First forms minute, unseen by spheric glass, move on the mud or pierce the watery mass. These, as successive generations bloom, new powers acquire and larger limbs assume, whence countless groups of vegetation spring and breathing realms of fin and feet and wing. So that's kind of neat, saying that, well, life did evolve and gradually develop from tiny little forms. And as you can see at the bottom, these footnotes explain what he meant. Now, in some of these, they're way off, but some are quite sensible. And so he's saying brineless tides, the salt of the seawater gradually accumulating, blah, blah. The sea must have originally as fresh as river water. So it's talking about how the sea got briny. And again, here we are, insects. Oh yeah, and there we are. Where is it? I'm trying to find that. Number 327. Well, this is refers to line 327. Yeah, in countless swarms, an insect myriad moves from sea fan gardens and from coral groves. So here saying after islands or continents were raised above the primeval ocean, great numbers of the most simple animals would attempt to seek food at the edges or shores of the new land and might thence gradually become amphibious, as is now seen in the frog. So you see he's putting forward what we now know to be, in fact, the sequence of events. So have a look at that. It's really quite charming to read. And there's a lot written about Erasmus Darwin. So again, these accounts didn't really change a lot of people's minds, but the whole idea was that the idea that species and organisms were created and fixed was beginning to become less tenable. Now, again, another Frenchman, Georges Cuvier, founded the field of vertebrate paleontology by looking at the succession of fossil species in the Paris Basin. He established that extinction was a real fact, and that is just as part of evolution as speciation. Interestingly, he was very much against Lamarck, fellow Frenchman. Both had a big influence on evolutionary biology, but Lamarck's views were controversial in one way, that really upset the French and the Catholic Church at the time. I'll get on to that next. But Cuvier did recognize that extinction was a part of the history of life, but he wasn't quite ready to accept evolution as such. He thought there were regular catastrophes, that there were local floods or droughts that destroyed the species then present. So that would explain the fossils found in a particular geological stratum. And then this area would be repopulated by species coming in from other unaffected areas. Now, moving to a Scottish geologist, James Hutton, he made the very important point that, in fact, you didn't have to have these catastrophes, that given enough time, then the Earth's geomorphology and landscape would develop over very long periods through events that were still occurring, but very, very, very slowly. And the Earth, of course, must be much older than the 6,000 years or so that was calculated from looking at the Bible. And the point is, this is gradualism, that profound change results from slow, continuous processes using the same mechanisms that are currently operating. Excuse me, the gradual erosion of river valleys by the great periods of time of water gradually flowing through and so on. So again, this is really important. You don't have to propose anything different in the past than what is happening at present. Now, Lamarck, again, a very, very interesting person. His full name, Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Antoine de Monet Chevalier de Lamarck, was originally in the military, but he actually had a bit of a distinguished career, but he had an injury and had to leave. But his real love was biology, and he, in fact, was elected to the French Academy of Science for his work on the botany of France, but also was a very good invertebrate zoologist, and in 1809 published his theory of evolution, basically based on his observations of fossil invertebrates. He thought he could see several lines of descent leading from fossils to current species, and this was a chronological series going from the older to younger fossils leading to a modern species. Now, he did promote, of course, as everybody knows, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now, he wasn't original with him, and other people, including Darwin, would use this, but unfortunately, he's become really associated with it and somewhat ridiculed because it, in its exaggerated form, just doesn't seem possible, and it certainly doesn't work. So the typical thing is the evolution of the giraffe's neck. It's the use during the life of the individual that elongates the neck and then is passed on to the offspring, the use it or lose it idea. And body parts used to cope with the environment became enhanced, those not used deteriorated, and modifications acquired during the life of an offspring of an organism could be passed to the offspring. Now, Mendelian genetics showed that that wasn't true, but of course now we have it as kind of a quasi-Lamarckian revival with, of course, epigenetics, not nearly as dramatic as this, but it is Lamarckian in a way. Now, I have quite an interesting lecture that I might give sometime on Lamarckians of the 20th century. And in fact, Lamarck's ideas, inheritance of acquired characteristics, did survive well into the Darwinism period, and even some very prominent biologists in the 20th century were Lamarckians, believe it or not. So, unfortunately, though, this is what Lamarck has been associated with and ridiculed about. Now, however, his more interesting and more controversial contribution was, of course, this idea of these chains of life going from the, so for instance, this is the inarticulate animals, the ones without segments, from these little infusories, tiny little microorganisms, on to the multicellular ones. And he, and same here with the segmented organisms, assumed that there was kind of what's sometimes described as an escalator of life, going from the simple to the complex, that was constantly occurring. So you had an organism appearing, and then gradually through time it and its descendants would become more and more complex. Now, the critical point about this was this assumed continual spontaneous degeneration of life. Now, this is what really upset most biologists at the time, and also the church, the Catholic Church and the other Christian churches, because this was the doctrine that life had been formed once right at the beginning. This idea of special creation of every single species, which would be unchanging. And this continuous spontaneous generation was a big sticking point. And this is why Lamarck was particularly disliked during his life, and that's why Cuvier was a particular adversary of his, because all the scientists of that time were strictly religious. Same in England with the scientists belonging to the Church of England, and this idea of the change of species really was so revolutionary that a lot of people didn't want to accept. And this is what Darwin was worried about himself. So there's a lot of interesting things about Lamarck, and now he's actually reckoned to be a far more influential and brilliant biologist than for many periods of time was thought to be. Now, in Britain, Sir Charles Lyell, a very great geologist who wrote the Principles of Geology, that greatly influenced Darwin. He also took Hutton's idea even further, this idea of uniformitarianism, but was very much against Lamarck's theories of transformation, and did not at all agree with Lamarck's mechanism of also, he could not accept that humans were not different from any other animals. He always thought they had a special place in nature. And even though he was a strong supporter of Darwin, he still didn't agree with Darwin on this point. Again, this is something that today a lot of people, still have trouble with. And this is the point that Darwin made, was humans were just part of the evolution of organisms, just like anything else. And in fact, Lyell mocked Lamarck quite a bit in the Principles of Geology. And again, when you think of Lamarck, this is quite a neat little cartoon. You think of the giraffe's neck. This is Lyell, although by mocking Lamarck, actually he gave him and his ideas quite a lot of publicity in the Principles of Geology. There is the Penguin edition of this book. You can get it out of the library and actually read this if you like. Now, interestingly, just before Darwin, a few people had some much more rigorous ideas of evolution and selection, and Patrick Matthew, in fact, came up with basically what is very similar to the Darwin-Wallace idea of natural selection. But he obviously didn't follow it up much. He wasn't really a biologist, and it was published in an extremely obscure publication in 1831 on naval timber and arboriculture. And although he basically put down the basic ideas of natural selection, he really didn't believe in evolutionary change. He was still a catastrophist. But after Darwin published On the Origin, there was a bit of a controversy saying that Darwin wasn't original in this, and people picked up on Patrick Matthews' older writings. But so that's kind of an interesting history. Now, Darwin, who lived from 1809 to 1882, and interestingly, Darwin was born on exactly the same day that Abraham Lincoln in the US was born. They had shared exactly the same birthday in 1809. But also Alfred Russel Wallace, shown here, they did independently come up with the idea of natural selection in a very rigorous form. But Darwin, of course, had been working on this idea for a long time previously. And in 1858, there was a joint paper, two papers, one by Darwin, one by Wallace, presented to the Linnean Society in London. So they both get joint credit for natural selection. But then Darwin in 1859 set it all out in a great deal of detail with many other things on the origin of species. And he made three main points. One, this idea of descent with modification, which is a really nice way of describing evolution. And the idea, of course, of a branching tree of life starting from original single-celled organisms, diversifying over time through a phylogeny to what we see in the present day. One major mechanism was natural selection. And one thing that was totally unique to Darwin was his idea of sexual selection that we'll talk about later. And that's become a very big area in biology, although interestingly, it was ignored as being important for a long time. In fact, it really only had its revival in the 1970s, believe it or not. And even natural selection as a mechanism was not really accepted by most people immediately. The idea of evolution was, but again, it wasn't really until the 1930s that actually natural selection was fully accepted. Now, later on, we will discuss this figure on the origin. It was the only figure, and he devotes quite a lot of time to this in his chapter on selection, natural selection. And it really shows, when you go through that, all of the ideas that Darwin had in very great detail and explains a lot of things. So we will go through this and we'll analyze it and see what an incisive and interesting thing that this describes. So again, we'll come back to that later. Now, the origin of species really did change the world, and A.J.P. Taylor, in an introduction to Marx's The Communist Manifesto, makes the point that these two publications in the 1800s, The Origin of Species and The Communist Manifesto, both were highly significant works that changed the world, since Darwin, of course, changed people's view that life and species were fixed. Of course, Marxism changed the world with the rise of communism in Russia, then to become the USSR, and what we see today in China. Both of these things originated in the 1800s. And it's difficult to realize that the view at the time in the Western nations like Britain, France, Germany, was that of the Christian Bible, the Old Testament, that special creation species were individually designed and did not evolve. And you'll see as we go through Darwin's On the Origin that this was the hypothesis, if you like, that Darwin compared his hypothesis of natural selection with. And in many, many instances, he says, well, if under special creation, we would expect this, but under natural selection, we would expect this. And natural selection is the more parsimonious. That's a word that's used quite a lot in evolutionary biology, parsimonious or parsimony. The explanation that's the most efficient, that involves the fewest assumptions and makes sense of what we actually see. So again, you'll find that very interesting when we go through on the origin. And of course, at that time, the dominant philosophy of science was natural theology, because of course people did science. They did extremely good observations, dissections, descriptions of species, other areas of proper science. But in biology, this natural theology was purely for showing the evidence that the Creator had designed each species for a purpose. And William Paley, of course, wrote one of the main books on this, and Darwin, of course, actually read it and you know, was very convinced by it until he started to think about things himself. Now, there's this website, the UCMP Berkeley, the University of California Museum of Paleontology. If you go to that website, you'll find a lot of little historical sketches, but also a great deal about all life on Earth, systematics, photographs, and so on, and a whole section on evolution. So that's a very good reference to look at. I won't go to it now, but I will have a link there on the website. So this is in the 1700s. Views were changing, and there was a lot of science done. There was a lot of exploration trips from Britain and other European countries, traveling around the world, collecting specimens, and it was realized how diverse organisms were. And as you know, of course, at this time, Linnaeus, Swedish botanist, started to develop a proper system of taxonomy and the system of binomial nomenclature, which really made things manageable, because with a great deal of new species discovered and put in museums, they had to be described and classified. So this was a good start. And then, of course, with Darwin putting it on an evolutionary phylogenetic basis, we now had modern evolutionary biology. Now, we will spend a bit of time later on zoological nomenclature. I don't really cover botanical nomenclature. It's basically the same, but I'm a zoologist, so obviously like animals best. And we will spend quite a bit of time on that, because it really is important to understand the system, how things are named, and that explains to you, when taxonomic revisions are done, why names change, but why the whole system is very important. So this is a big part of biology and evolutionary biology today. Now, I'll only speak for a couple more minutes, and then I will continue a little bit with this tomorrow, because, as I said, I do sort of overlap lectures and labs. What we will do tomorrow is to, I'll finish a little bit of this. I'll talk about the labs and actually get you started on doing things, but I'll just say one more thing today. As I've said, evolution was accepted as a fact from Darwin's writings to the early 20th century. Nobody doubted that after a while. There was considerable debate, but the importance of natural selection was still questioned. And as I said, Lamarckian inheritance was still very popular. Even Sir Francis Darwin, one of Charles Darwin's children, was president of the British Association for Arts and Science, and he was quite a Lamarckian. He stated very clearly his belief in the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And so on. Now, Peter Bowler, historian of biology, has written a couple of interesting books on what he calls the eclipse of Darwinism in the early or through to the early 20th century. And it makes very interesting reading. But of course, it was in the early decades of the 1900s that once Mendel's work had been rediscovered, that gradually inheritance of acquired characteristics faded away, and the modern synthesis started with the combination of the development of population genetics with Mendelism. So I'll leave that there for today, and I'll continue this tomorrow. So I just want to go back here and I'll come back. So I'm not presenting anything on the screen, but I see quite a few people are still here, which is very good. And I'll stop recording now if I can find the thing. So I'll just stop recording now. So